My name is Allison Unruh, and I'm an associate curator at the Kemper Art Museum here at Washington University. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the inaugural Women and the Kemper lecture, which will be presented by Professor Shelley Rice. I want to sincerely thank Women in the Kemper, a wonderful members group that supports the museum in many important ways, for their generosity in supporting this lecture. It's a real privilege to introduce Shelley Rice, whose scholarship and writing on photography has pushed forward the field in critical ways over the past several decades, including reconsidering historically overlooked figures or categories of works that fall outside traditional aesthetic realms, spanning from the origins of photography to the contemporary global world. The ethos of her work is captured in the subject of her presentation tonight, which explores the Brazilian photographer Marc Ferrez's work, asking us to rethink the very notion of the center and periphery in discourses of modern image making. Professor Rice teaches at New York University, where she holds a joint appointment in the Department of Art History and the Department of Photography and Imaging. She is a historian and critic whose numerous publications include, just to name a few, the book Parisian Views, published by MIT Press in 1997, a groundbreaking study of the relationship of photography and the reshaping of the urban landscape in mid-19th century Paris under Baron Haussmann, and essays and monographs on figures such as Jacques-Henri Lartigue, Vic Muniz, Candida Hoffer, Marc Ferrez, and Hank Willis Thomas, among others. Her essays are included in important surveys, such as A New History of Photography, first published in Paris in 1995, and the US in 1999, and the Book of 101 Books, seminal photographic books of the 20th century, published in 2001. Professor Rice's articles, essays, reviews, and columns have appeared in numerous publications, including Art Forum, Art in America, Art Journal, The New Republic, Aperture, Tate Papers, The Art Newspaper, and Africana.org, among others. She has served as guest curator of several significant exhibitions, including one of my favorites, Inverted Odysseys, Claude Cahin, Maya Deren, and Cindy Sherman at NYU's Gray Art Gallery in 1999 to 2000, which she co-curated with Lynn Gumpert, which won the International Art Critics Association Award for Best Photography Exhibition in the US that year. A former Guggenheim and Fulbright Fellow, she has won the Penn Gerard Award for Nonfiction Essay, a Hasselblad grant from Sweden, and was named a Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters by the French government in 2010. Currently, she is the host of a radio talk show in which she interviews a variety of art and cultural figures entitled The Meeting Point with Shelley Rice, which can be found on the online magazine of the Jeu de Paume Museum in Paris. And in addition to these distinctions, Professor Rice is a really inspiring teacher and mentor to countless students and scholars, including myself. I was fortunate enough to serve as her teaching assistant 10 years ago at NYU. And so fittingly, she was selected as the recipient of the 2014-15 David Payne Carter Award for Excellence in Teaching at the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU, where she was nominated by her students who described how she brought history to life for them. So please join me in welcoming our honored speaker tonight, Shelley Rice.
Bet you didn't expect to see Vic Muniz up here. But the expectation was for a dead person. This one is alive. Vic is up here because as I was organizing this talk, I realized that one of the ways to make Marc Ferrez's work really very present for everyone was to first begin with a discussion of how art history changes when everything else changes. And one of the things about the art history education that I had, which at the end I focused on photo, is that basically we did have a sense that, basically you learned about the white guys from Paris, Germany, from Europe, from New York, from America, and essentially history was shaped according to plans by these people. Now what this does is, of course, set up a situation where there is a center and where there is a periphery, where somebody from Brazil, and as I will show you, Marc Ferrez was one of the really very famous photographers of the 19th century, who kind of got washed away as we actually shaped our historical narrative. And so one of the things that I really wanted to do today was talk about, as we look at the collection that's upstairs and contextualize what we're talking about, somebody like Marc Ferrez helps everybody to understand that the new global reality of the art world, the global biennales, the big fairs, the international, the way we all zoom around all the time and travel together, the collection becoming more and more global, that kind of interaction and the questions that are raised by living artists from various places are really the things that push historians like me to reevaluate and rethink the historical narratives that I learned in school, and that in fact, basically for a number of years in my scholarship and teaching, I obviously followed. I mean, if you don't, what you don't know, you can't work with. One of the, as Allison mentioned, I've done a couple of books involving Vic Muniz. He's a friend, and spending time with Vic Muniz, who is an incredibly smart man, is really one of the things that moved me to really understand what you can learn from seeing things from another perspective. This is a picture that Vic did. He's a whole lot older now, so it's really kind of funny to see this. I Am the Other. He showed this in 1988 in New York City at Stuck's Gallery. Now, Vic grew up in a very poor circumstance in a favela in Brazil. His family was really poor. His father made something like $100 a month working for rich families. And he grew up, and he was and remains incredibly gifted as a draftsman. So Vic he managed to get to school, and he managed to develop a career in like commercial drawing and to commercial design. And he was very good at it, and so he actually won an award, and he went to the award ceremony. Now, you're talking about a 22 or 3-year-old. He went to the award ceremony. He came out. Now, as we all know, Brazil can be extremely dangerous. And he came out, and 2 guys were fighting. And he basically went up to the guys to stop them from fighting, and one of them shot him. Right? And he will, to this day, show you the scar on his thigh. Now, the guy who shot him was very wealthy, and therefore didn't want him making any trouble, and so just sort of handed him a lot of cash. Now, this is a person who didn't have a lot of cash, and so he just used it to get a ticket to, in fact, he went to Chicago, because he wanted to start over here, and he had family here. So anyway, he arrives in Chicago, he works in a supermarket, and he's learning English. He's sitting there in the house watching TV, he's listening to people, and the process by which, and this is really how I learned a lot, the process by which he became literally an American, all right, because he is now an American citizen, essentially, as somebody pushing the carts in supermarkets, this person who'd been winning awards for design in Brazil, the way he became an American was to watch TV and to read books, look at photographs, okay? Now, I think everybody here's probably seen the movie Blade Runner, and the thing that distinguishes, a sort of robot from a person is memories. And basically, Vic's point of view agreed with that. He found a book in a flea market called The Best of Life, which I used a lot when I was young. And he memorized all the photos because he realized that the difference between him and an American was that he didn't have memories. Okay? And so Vic basically learned all the pictures. Then at some point he was at the beach, and he had his book in his bag because he carried the book around because that was his memory. And somebody stole the bag. So he didn't have his pictures anymore. So he began to do the series that made him very famous, okay, which was that he drew all the pictures that he remembered, so these are drawings, that he then rephotographed, okay, so they're sort of 3rd generation. Basically the point of all this was that this is the way in which he was becoming acclimated, that you learn the memories that everybody else has so that you can talk about them. This is what he's doing now. Basically, Vic got very famous from this idea of the visual culture and, proposing this. He's done a lot of things since. He is now back in Brazil most of the time, and he's doing pictures like this that work with, this is actually, he has a hangar for a studio in Brazil. It's absolutely enormous. Some of these are like trucks. These are huge things. And he's making pictures with huge amounts of studio assistants that, again, are working with Western icons. In this case, of course, the death of Marc by David. where he's reshaping them in his Brazilian studio out of trash. Now, the reason to start an essay on a lecture on Marc Ferrez with Vic is again to point out that spending time with this person and watching the way, like, we take our cultural heritage in a certain way. It's art history, it's worth a lot of money, it's at the Met, you know, we have this, it's dead, it's in the past, it's things that we study and revere. You know, for Vic, these things are things that he appropriates as a Brazilian, he works with, he figures out how to arrange, and how to, again, make them, you know, becoming an American citizen for him was memorizing, you know, all of this stuff about Western culture. And so, having spent time with people like him and Wally Rye and other people and learning the ways in which they deal with culture, eventually it becomes really necessary as a historian to broaden the perspective on photo history or on art history. Okay, and to look a little bit more closely, because if you have somebody like Vic who is so unbelievably aware of how to mix cultures and how to use, you know, French painting and American popular culture and ways in which to merge these things to make, you know, some incredibly famous art, right, and to put back from the point of view of a Brazilian some commentary, in fact, on, you know, on Western cultural imagery. You know, it makes one very anxious to see whether our concept of photo history is just as narrow as perhaps our concepts of art and popular culture and centers and peripheries. Now, the best case in point that I know of is Marc Ferrez. Now, this was a very famous man. He was famous in St. Louis, he was famous in London, he was famous in Paris. He was one of the first people to bring film to Brazil. He knew everybody, and he was incredibly well connected. And he is the best proof that we have that the idea of a periphery makes absolutely zero sense, because this man was not in it. This man went back and forth to Paris. He bought, you know, he contributed. He won medals over the French people. He this and this. And then, as I said, he was just summarily dismissed in a way that won't happen now in a world where we have people like Vic Muniz, who of course have shown us that one can be an American citizen who's in Brazil, who is world famous, you know, shows all over the place, and that in fact that this contribution is very multifaceted. Now in his case, his family was French. His parents came in 1817 to Rio de Janeiro with the French Artistic Mission, which I assume was probably to teach Brazilians how to make Western art. By the time he was born, which was quite a while later, he was the youngest of 6 kids. You know, they were just very much Brazilians. And so he was born in Rio de Janeiro. His parents died when he was young. And he ended up, you know, being sent away to France to grow up. He was brought up by a sculptor and engraver in Paris. Now, this put him in the 1850s and 60s, when there were incredible numbers of things going on in France. It put him in France. You know, he obviously learned photography there, because he came back to Rio and got very involved in photography and opened up a studio already by 1867 when he was in his 20s. But he watched a whole lot of the things that really have changed and shaped modernist photography and ideas of cities and all kinds of different things, as you'll see. And by the time he got back to Brazil, I think there was a German who was working there. There were various people who had studios, and he very, very quickly became the major photographer in Brazil. And part of that, of course, had to do with the fact that, like Vic Muniz, that he was completely connected all over the place. That, you know, this particular picture like this one, you know, he brought back Brandon cameras. He brought back the major panoramic cameras, state of the art. He was like, you know, the man that brought technological things back. But he also brought back a whole lot of attitudes toward image making, which then he did his work and brought it back to France and brought it to St. Louis, and he won the medal for photography in the 1904 St. Louis Fair. This was our guy, okay? It wasn't a French person, and it wasn't an American, it was a Brazilian, okay? The one we forget now. And so, but basically, his use of panoramic cameras, his ability to conceptualize a city like Rio, which is so gorgeous and so is steeped in nature and natural beauty, that these things were considered really inspirational by people in Paris and people in St. Louis, and he then added very much to the dialogue that was going on. So this was literally a life not that different on some levels from Vic Muniz's. Now, this picture's from 1885. He had gone back to Paris in the late 1870s and brought back the panoramic cameras. Now, in the history, okay, I'm going to talk about various aspects of things. One of the things that was going on in France was, while he was there, and certainly since he went back and forth, he saw this, was a rethinking, a total rebuilding of Paris, a restructuring of a city in 2 and 3 dimensions, because a lot of the photographers, as I'll show you, including some that are up in your collection show, were involved with, the reshaping of the city, turning it into a modern city, getting rid of the medieval streets and rebuilding them. And the photographer's role, someone like Charles Marville, who I'll show and who also was upstairs, Charles Marville was the official photographer of the city of Paris, and his job was to restructure the 2-dimensional image people had of a city, okay, of his city. This is one aspect of the work that he's doing, and part of that was, of course, the concept of a panorama, because the 19th century considered itself the panoramic city. It had World's Fairs. It started the World's Fairs, panoramas of the globe. It had illustrated magazines that were supposed to be all over the globe, and and it also, the idea of a city, instead of a city just being one neighborhood, the idea of urban planning, of thinking of a city as an organism, of developing, ideas of landscape and ideas of urban environments that were overviews, all right? There were hot air balloons. They'd been invented in 1787. The idea of the panorama, the overview, was really central to the way people thought at that time. So all of these things were things that Marc Ferrez brought back with him. All right. On the other hand, again, his concept of what a city is, since Rio is such a different animal from Paris physically, that had a big impact also on the way Europeans thought about their cities. Again, it was very different, but it was very inspiring. Now, that's one thing. The other thing that I really want to mention that's really important to me as a photo historian is that the history of photography as it was sort of as it developed in France, is that in the 1850s you had all these very hip people, a lot of them rich guys who'd been in art school, had learned painting, decided to see what they could do with photography, and then you had people like Nadar who were incredibly out there doing stuff. You had this amazing golden age in the 1850s when nobody could figure out what photography was and everybody tried everything, okay? By 1859 in France, you had, it was sort of like, you had just had filet mignon and McDonald's arrived. Okay, by 1859, the carte de visite arrived. Photography became enormously big business. People were putting out thousands of images per day. The people who were really incredibly serious image makers, they got out of the field. It was sort of like, the startup business, the tech companies at the very beginning. I know some of the people who started those things, and there was a certain point where they really smelled toxicity, and they ran, okay? And that's what happened in photo in Europe, so that you ended up with a very sharp divide between like a studio photography for taking assignments, etc., which in the 1850s you had some of the great minds of photography doing that. After this, you had the studios who were catering to the mass public, and then a lot of the really amazing people just stayed out of it. Okay, they just kind of disappeared. The interesting thing about Marc Ferrez is that Marc Ferrez, and this is really what I kind of want to show you today, is the incredible range of his work, because he was not in the center, because he was in a place where there was less pressure on him. He opened up a commercial studio, and he ran a commercial studio from 1867 until he died in something like 1914 or something. Yeah, he died, much later, 1920 or something. He died really late, okay, and his sons had been taking over the studio. But because he didn't have that same kind of, in France, everyone was worried about whether photography could be art. They all thought about it. They made sure that, photography got into exhibitions. They were, and they were very clear that there was a certain kind of, elite consciousness and elite way of shaping things. It was not the way all these people, these McDonald's people were doing their thing, et cetera, et cetera. And that wasn't happening in Brazil. He had a business. He was hired by the government. You'll see he photographed waterworks, he photographed, reconstruction of streets, he photographed the native, people in Bahia, he photographed native Indian people, he photographed, train, the building of trains. He took assignments, he did them. He did unbelievably beautiful things, and he never, over the practically 50 years that he had a studio, he never felt constrained by his commercial work or having to, pigeonhole artwork. He took these pictures were for sale in his studio, okay, and they were also winning awards in 1904 in St. Louis. And so the advantage of being on the periphery was precisely that the kind of very significant lines that got drawn between art and everything else by around 1860 in Paris never affected him one way or the other. And it is also, of course, one of the reasons why we could brush him under the rug so easily. Oh, he's a commercial photographer. He's not an artist. Why would we look at him? In the case of the French people like Marville, he was only a commercial photographer. He didn't show in any of these things. He didn't win medals. He didn't do anything. But we, of course, have transformed him into the predecessor of Atget and therefore an artist. Atget was only a commercial photographer. French people can be moved up to the art category, and I think it's kind of time to give the Brazilians the same respect. Anyway, so let me just start showing you some of these gorgeous pictures. The reason that I'm involved with him is that when the Instituto Morales Salas, when they did a book on Marc Ferrez for the 450th anniversary of Rio. And they wanted like an outside opinion, especially something related to the idea of urban development in France, and I wrote that. I think Allison bought the book for the museum. It's a wonderful book. I mean, the Brazilians wrote essays on urban development, history of photography. It's an incredibly smart overview of the way this body of work fit into a global world, as well as the very specific nature of the city. And one of the things that Sergio Bergi, everybody, all the authors mention, that Brazilians, like, we go to Brazil and go, oh my God, Rio is gorgeous. It's like, it looks like this, you know what I mean? It just takes your breath away. There's sugar loaf, and I think, I don't think you saw that much of it. It was very kind of kitschy what you saw for the Olympics, but it is utterly stunning. And this really pisses off the Brazilians. I mean, it's like, okay, people, it's like you're always looking at the nature, and how about what we do, okay? And so again, I first of all realize that, of course, since Europeans and Americans are very interested in what we do in the built environment, that in fact, they feel like they don't get a fair shake in terms of what they've contributed to the built environment, and that they're always competing with nature. Now, again, one of the interesting things is that this was one of the problems that Marc Ferrez faced as he was taking photographs of the city of Rio as it was being rebuilt at around 1900, 1910, and as various areas were being rebuilt and as he was being hired to deal with them. Now, one of the things he got very famous for are these panoramas of landscape views. And one thing about even his really big panoramas, most of the time in his pictures, and this bears out what Sergio Bergi was saying, there's almost always people. I mean, obviously something like this is really big. Probably if I looked hard enough, I'd find a person. Yeah, there's like a boat, there's a boat over there. This is never a landscape that is just kind of there as a landscape. It's always a landscape where somebody's got a boat or somebody's looking, and I'm just saying this as I'm showing you pictures where that's not true. Sorry about that. But yeah, there's a lot of pictures of this kind where people are sitting around, where they're looking, where they're doing something, well, all right, you'll see them. But anyway, these are the pictures that he took that made him very famous in Europe, in London, and Philadelphia, in St. Louis. Are these very beautiful landscape pictures, of his city. This is one of my favorites. Look at those guys. This is actually taken from Sugarloaf Mountain, which of course was that big thing sticking up in other pictures. In this case, he's on the top. Or a sugar loaf over there. Sugar loaf. And now he's on the top of that, and he is looking at Urca Hill and Copacabana from the Sugarloaf Mountain. And again, this is where you start seeing his panoramic use of the landscape, dealing with the built environment within it, but also with the people who climb up Sugarloaf so they can look, so they can, like him, so they can check out the scene, so they can make a photograph, so they can check it out. So this idea of the landscape being there to be seen, but also to be built, is very central to his body of work. And here's what I mean about the people. Have any of you been to any, like a country fair in Brazil or anything like that? Or any of the, you know how everybody loves to be together in a crowd, like this? I was at one, in Minas Gerais. I was in a festival, and there was this woman with us, part of the crowd of people I was with, and she was like 9 months pregnant. I mean, her belly was like this, right? And we're walking in a crowd like this, and I'm like, don't you think you should go home? I mean, I'm acting like a New Yorker, right? Please go home. What if your baby gets hurt? And she looks at me and just, oh no. This lets my baby know there are other people to hang out with. It was a totally different attitude toward what was best for this baby. So again, there are pictures within this body of work, and this is actually, this picture is a picture of the unveiling of the statue of Pedro Alvarez during the 400th anniversary of the celebration of the discovery of Brazil. This took place on the 3rd of May in 1900. And again, what I am trying to sort of juxtapose here, since this is a huge body of work, I mean, they have thousands of, the negatives are all in the Instituto, and they have thousands of them, something like 5,000 negatives and then prints. And there is this constant seesawing back of the nature, but also of the impact of humans on nature and that built environment and how it relates. Okay, this is Uvida Street, and this is from 1890. This is not a street that's rebuilt. I'll show you when streets get rebuilt. Now, again, the range of his work is something I really want to point out because, again, this was a public studio. He worked on commission. He also was very curious, and one of the things about looking at South American photography from the early 20th century, from the 19th century, is that the people who were working in photography had a tendency to be interested in other kinds of people. Blacks in Bahia, street vendors, native people. Shambi was the same. There was a lot of interest in those places that does not, for instance, show up particularly. I mean, again, the native people issue is different, but in Europe, I mean, I'll show you at some point William Henry Jackson, but these were Wild West photographers. You didn't see a New York studio photographer or a St. Louis studio photographer going out of their way to find a Native American. So this becomes part of, again, the differences in the way the studios work. Now, on the one hand, these two are by Marc Ferrez, and these are like petit métier. This is a category of art history that is very traditional in France. It's really traditional in Europe in general, but France in particular. And there was a history that he would have known, not only of like prints, of paintings, and then of photographs of petit métier, basically, small tradesmen on the city streets. We have paintings in New York City that are like this. This idea of street types ends up becoming an enormous trope worldwide in Peru, in Spain, all over, in around 1900, 1910, when he had his studio and it was working. And this is one of his small tradesmen on the street, and of course, Ache was at the same time doing things like this. And he, again, there is a very high probability that he would have known about this. But this way, we have celebrated Ache, who also had a commercial studio, and in fact probably is laughing in his grave at how famous he is. But Ache, took pictures of this kind. They were part of, things he sold in his studio. People were very interested in pictures of small tradespeople. And, again, these are things that Marc Ferrez would very much have, the same environment that would have created Atget's need to do this would have also been very intriguing and interesting to Marc Ferrez. Now, but on the other hand, Marc Ferrez also had Bahia, and in Bahia you had you had, now this is actually sort of interesting. I remember a Brazilian talking to me about these. He has shoes on, which means he's not a slave. One of the interesting things, like, I'm talking to you about the ins and outs of photo history, but during the period of time that Marc Ferrez, was working, you had, slavery abolished, you had, a court government turned into a republic, and, a very different idea of government. You had revolutions, you had all kinds of political changes. He worked for, the royal government. He was, Don Pedro's favorite person. He had huge commissions. He was knighted by the government, and then he worked with the later government. When it turned into a different kind of more democratic situation, he worked with that. But within that, within Brazil, it isn't just a homogenous modernist culture. You also had the culture from Bahia with different kinds of people and different traditions. And this was of great interest to him. And within his studio, he didn't just define modernism as, what was happening in Rio and Sao Paulo. He was also traveled around and did a tremendous amount of work in other parts of Brazil with different kinds of people that were part of his practice. Generally speaking, in the history of photography, if people took pictures like this, we would just take them out and just show the pictures that looked like French pictures. We did that with French people. When I started studying Nadar, all we talked about were his portraits of famous painters. Nadar did incredible. He did sewer pictures. He did pictures in the catacombs. He did pictures from hot air balloons. He did all kinds of pictures. It was me who showed them for the first time because people, again, have very narrow understandings. Again, if you're working with photography, 85% at least of the people who we love as photographic artists were people who were making a living. Like, let's get real here, okay? It is completely hypocritical to sit around and talk about, the artsy, this and this. Nadar had a studio, he supported himself with it. Actually had a studio, he supported himself with it. Now, what that means is that these people are not working, they're not working autonomously. They're not self-expressing. They might be self-expressing, and certainly at the end of Atget's life, he did quite a lot of that. But they're also people who, by choice of trade, are very responsive to their audiences. What are people interested in? How does this translate? How am I going to make the studio floating, keep it afloat? Now, he kept his studio afloat. Most of the studios in America, like the William Henry Jackson studio, Bonfils's studio, now Bonfils's upstairs, his studio in the Middle East, these things were going belly up. By the end of the 19th century, you had you had the Kodak, you had roll film, you had all kinds of international companies that were distributing work, that were setting up, you had huge factories that were producing photographic chemicals, photographic plates, photographic this and that, and the studios were just going belly up because there was no reason to pay somebody a lot of money when you could buy things cheaply. His studio didn't go belly up. This is what I'm saying. He did not have the pressure that people had in Europe and America, the pressures of industrialization. I mean, he was, like I said, very industrialized. But he worked, you see the studio photographer on some level in a really developed form in the way he managed to handle it for 50 years in a way that somebody like Nadar would have had a hard time doing. Now here, these are just some comparisons with people that are in your show upstairs. This is Bonfils, who I just mentioned. As I said, his studio, I've been working with this crazy Swiss company called Photoglob, which is still in existence, which started photolithographs and eventually the postcard business. And they bought up pictures from tons of studios from 200 different suppliers all over the world to start postcards and tourist pictures. And they basically, because these guys were going belly up in 1887, Bonfils's son sold a lot of their images to postcards, which means that if you actually start looking in the bowels of libraries, these pictures that we bow and scrape for and pay millions of dollars for, you'll find them on a postcard from 1910, because they sold the rights to the image, and that's how basically people essentially, took their inventory and sold it, because the studio system, as an individual system, was not working in this heavily industrialized world. Now these are, let's see, these are both from watercellars in Cairo. And both of them are from around 1865. The images were again sold for postcards in like the 1880s. Okay, this is a very cool image, and I'm sorry about the quality of it, but I couldn't find any of these in any art source. One of the things Ferrez did, as I said, was travel around and photograph native Indian, people. Like I said, the absence of these pictures in any book or any, an art store or anything like that, it speaks volumes about the ways in which we define photography, but it has nothing to do with the way he lived, because he, in fact, was known in Brazil for having taken pictures of indigenous people while he was traveling around the country. And again, just making a connection to people that are in your collection are very well known. This is a wonderful image. I just actually found it on the internet. This is a woman, this is by Edward Curtis, and it is from this tribe called Diegueno, which is actually from San Diego. These are San Diego native people. And now Curtis was one of the people whose studio sold work for postcards. Basically William Henry Jackson. Again, I think I have one of his now. This is William Henry Jackson. William Henry Jackson is incredibly famous for, he did these things he went on government surveys in the 1870s and he took pictures of the American West. And they're very, very well-known pictures. Again, they were work made for hire. The fact is, William Henry Jackson is one of the most amazing people in the history of photography. He lived to be about 100. He was involved in absolutely every technological shift in the medium. He did all kinds of interesting things, including being the person responsible for the Detroit Photographic Company, which was the American arm of this photoglob company in Switzerland. He ran a studio, he traveled around, he negotiated with Curtis, Roman, all these people to sell works. He photographed in Cuba, he photographed in South America. He did all these things, and he donated 10,000 of his images. That was his employment deal. They gave him, they bought the contents of his studio. So every one of those William Henry Jackson pictures that we just bow and scrape over in the Met, every one of them went into the archive for photographic postcards, basically. Again, photography is incredibly mobile. Things are never what they appear to be. Now, another thing, of course, that was very important, like in America, this is the finishing of the Transatlantic Railroad. And you have, photographers like A.J. Russell, who were, celebrating this, and later on I'll talk about Baldus, who did amazing train pictures in France. So this was a subject matter, and this is also a subject matter for Marc Ferrez. In this particular case, as in the case of Baldus or A.J. Russell, who worked for the railroads, he was hired by the Sao Paulo Railroad. He traveled around. It's one of the things that got him the opportunity to travel around and meet the indigenous people and everybody else. And he photographed, so on one hand, he's photographing native people and really customary attire in Bahia, and on the other hand, he's doing the absolute cutting-edge technologies. And again, with an eye to, I'm sure, having seen Baldus's photographs in France and being very well aware of this as an important subject in photography globally. Now, this particular picture is by Baldus. Again, I'm making a comparison here. Baldus made the train album for Queen Victoria, the Eurostar that now goes from Paris to London. That line. He was hired to make the first album for Queen Victoria of pictures from that line, and a lot of these pictures are from that. And again, these are very well-known pictures in France. This was a subject, if you had a studio, which he did. He was also a commercial photographer. Baldus, who was one of the great image makers of France of the 19th century, was never an artist. He worked commercially only. Now he's in the Met, but that wasn't his life. And he would make pictures like this for his studio, and then, of course, people would come and buy them because, again, the railroads were major deals. Then again, when he would get hired by this actual album, a lot of the pictures already existed in his studio, and the very famous album that was made for Queen Victoria was paid for by the Rothschilds because they owned that railroad line. Here's more. He also worked, Baldus did, Collard, another one of his colleagues, totally commercial, specialized in architectural photography, did a whole series on aqueducts. Because it was in the 19th century that the French figured out that it was really necessary to bring water from outside to cities because people were dying of cholera. And Collard did some of the most beautiful, beautiful architectural and engineering pictures of the 19th century. Again, not an artist, not particularly known in this country, but very much, engaged by the government. Now, the government of Brazil also engaged Marc Ferrez. This is a Marc Ferrez photo of waterworks. He did a ton of pictures of waterworks, I think another idea, of the systems of water that were being set up in Brazil at the time when he was working. These pictures are from 1886 and 1888. Now this is one of my favorite projects, and it is on some level the most French. He was hired in the early 1900s to photograph the reconstruction of the Central Avenue of Rio. He did this, over a period of years, and there's a huge, actually we have two of the albums, I don't know where we got this incredible embarrassment of riches, because there aren't many of them. We have two of them in the New York Public Library, and they're different. Some of the pictures are the same, there are certain things that are different. It's really kind of exciting, because when I started working on this project, I discovered that these things are just sitting there. Now, one of the things about, again, if you go to Istanbul, if you go to Rio, there are these, one of the things that Europe, one of the models of behavior created in Europe was, of course, the urban environment, those big shopping streets, those, that you see everywhere, okay? European modernist architecture, and essentially the Avenida Central was that in Rio. This real desire to build a big, wide, important street that would echo their connection to French and European and modernist streets, Fifth Avenue, all right? And so the decision was made to sort of widen the street and do this. And of course, on the one hand, you have this language of architecture that is becoming global. Right? It's very exciting. But you also have, of course, the language of photography as a way of interpreting it. And this is where I think Marc Ferrez is on some level the most interesting, because, he has this problem, the Brazilian problem of, okay, we're building this thing, we're building all this stuff, we're redoing the city, and this is not Paris, okay? It isn't Paris. On the one hand, we're using a certain kind of architectural form that is, but our street goes to Sugarloaf Mountain. It doesn't go to the opera, okay? Our streets have to hug the bay. Our streets are working within a setting that's really different, and I find that he really is incredibly good at working with that. Now here's the construction picture, as you can see. Whoops, sorry. And here you see the street finished, and of course the vista. Now the vista's in France. In Paris, the whole idea of rebuilding the city was so that you could come up on Notre Dame and see it, that there would be vistas. That there would be vistas to the opera, that there would be vistas to the Bourse, that there would be vistas to all the different monuments, and you could really see them. Again, the French are landlocked. They are not struggling with this astonishing amount of water and nature. And their environment is a human one. And so what you are looking toward and working toward is precisely that human thing. Rio has another set of issues. Their vistas are Sugarloaf Mountain. And again, Marc Ferrez, you can say, oh, well, he's just copying the Europeans. I don't think so. And I don't think that, the environment was not allowing that. Okay, here's the finished, part of the finished street. And hold on, I'll show you a picture in a minute. But just again, to connect these pictures up with your collection, you have a Charles Marville photograph upstairs. I mentioned Charles Marville. He, in the 1860s, was named the official photographer of the city of Paris, and he was hired to do before, during, and after pictures of the total reconstruction, not total, the reconstruction of Paris that was designed to transform it from a medieval city with tiny little non-functional streets to a city where there were big boulevards, where there were vistas, where the train stations were connected to the things in the city, which you know, the trees and the water work with this, you know, and Notre Dame and basically nailing it down in the center, and the city itself as a you know, sort of fabric of bridges and, you know, bathing spots and churches and whatever. Whoops. This is a different problem. It is, again, as I said, it is the issue of defining nature. This is a problem by the architects, by the urban planners, and it is something that Marc Ferrez was charged with visualizing, which was a city that is working in tandem and competing with nature, and figuring out how to make an image of that in both 2 and 3 dimensions. Here's a few more of his really pretty pictures. Panoramas, and these are much more people-oriented in the sense that, you know, there's a lot of ships. He also was working, he was the official photographer for the Navy. He did a tremendous number of pictures of ships, of water. And in fact, he was, I think one of his first fames was he figured out a way to photograph on the water. He had a camera, and somehow there was a balancing act. He figured out a camera that could balance itself and take pictures actually on water. And this made him quite famous in Europe. People were quite interested in the possibilities of this. So, you know, you really are talking about somebody who worked with the Navy, who worked with the waterworks, who worked with the trains, who worked with the city on urban development. This is a very exciting life, I think. And it went on for a long time, and I don't have any sense that this man was bored. Look at that. Amazing. Yeah, he actually figured out how to make panoramas that were like a meter in length. But technically, the Europeans were in awe of him. And then to end up, you know, since, you know, he was the person who, on one of his trips to Paris, got the franchise, the license for Pathé, and opened up one of the first cinemas in Brazil. And so even at the tail end of his life, he was making sure that the Brazilians could have the cutting edge. I mean, there was no periphery feeling in this man's mind. I mean, the whole point was to make sure that this technology unified people as opposed to separating them and making them divisively unequal. Okay. That's all. Thank you.